Jake Cole stood in the center of the military tribunal with his hands bound behind his back. The cold metal cuffs bit into his wrists, but he barely felt them. 15 years he had given to the Galactic Coalition. 15 years of battles, of following orders, of watching friends die for a cause he believed in. Now he wore the gray uniform of the condemned, and those same commanders looked at him like he was nothing. General Harrison sat at the high bench, his face carved from stone and just as cold. His voice boomed through the chamber, bouncing off the metal walls. You refused a direct order, soldier. When your commanding officer told you to eliminate that settlement, you walked away. Do you understand what you've done? Jake lifted his chin and met the general's eyes. His voice came out steady even though his heart hammered in his chest. They were children, sir. 20 families living in those homes. Farmers. Teachers. Kids playing in the streets. Not rebels. Just people trying to survive. That was not your determination to make. Harrison's fist slammed on the desk. In war, we don't get to pick and choose which orders feel good. Civilian casualties are acceptable losses. The enemy was hiding among them. There was no enemy, Jake said quietly. Intelligence was wrong. I saw it with my own eyes. I wasn't going to burn innocent people alive because someone made a mistake. The other tribunal members whispered among themselves. Jake saw the verdict in their eyes before they even spoke it. They couldn't let this slide. If soldiers started questioning orders, started thinking for themselves, the whole system would collapse. The verdict came swiftly, wrapped in official language that tried to hide what it really was. Exiled to Draken Prime. They might as well have put a bullet in his head. It would have been Kinder. That frozen planet at the edge of known space was where they sent people they wanted to forget. No human had ever survived there longer than a week. The dragons made sure of that. They took everything from him. His armor, the one his father had helped him repair 100 times. His weapons, standard issue but customized to his grip. His rank, those hard-earned stripes that meant he'd kept his squad alive through hell. All of it stripped away like it had never mattered. What they left him with was insulting. Basic survival gear, the cheap kind they gave to new recruits. A thermal blanket thin enough to see through. 3 days of rations that tasted like cardboard. A knife that would probably snap if he looked at it wrong. Then they loaded him onto a transport and dropped him on the ice-covered peaks of a planet that didn't want him. Jake watched the transport disappear into the gray atmosphere, its engines fading to nothing. The silence that followed was complete. No birds. No insects. Just wind that howled like a dying animal and the distant roar of something massive moving through the mountains. The cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath turned to ice crystals before it left his mouth. His fingers went numb in seconds even inside his gloves. This was how he would die, he thought. Frozen solid on a rock nobody cared about. But he started walking anyway. Not because he had a plan. Not because he thought he could survive. Just because standing still meant giving up, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He moved to keep his blood flowing, to keep his muscles working, to pretend he had a purpose. 3 days passed. His rations ran out. The thermal blanket had torn on the second night. Jake's lips were cracked and bleeding, his face burned raw by the wind. He should have been dead already. Maybe he was and just hadn't realized it yet. That's when he heard the crying. The sound cut through the wind, sharp and desperate. It wasn't human. The noise was too high-pitched, too raw. Something young was making that sound. Something terrified. Every logical part of Jake's brain screamed at him to ignore it. He was barely alive himself. Whatever was making that noise was probably dangerous. This planet was full of things that could kill him. But his feet moved anyway. He followed the sound up a cliff face that should have been impossible to climb. His fingers, numb and clumsy, found cracks in the ice. His boots slipped a dozen times. His breath came in painful gasps that made his chest burn. At the top he found the nest. 3 dragon hatchlings sat in the center, each one the size of a full-grown bear. Their scales gleamed even in the dim light, and their eyes glowed like coals. They huddled around their mother's corpse. Her massive body was torn open, ribs exposed, scales shattered and scattered. Whatever had killed her must have been twice her size. The babies turned their glowing eyes toward Jake. The biggest one hissed, showing teeth already sharp as daggers. The middle one made a low growling sound in its throat. The smallest just whimpered, too cold and scared to do anything else. Jake should have walked away. He should have used his last strength to find shelter, to save himself. These creatures would grow into the apex predators that ruled this frozen hell. Their kind had killed every exile who'd come before him. They were his natural enemies. But as he looked at them, confused and freezing and abandoned by fate, he thought about those children back on that settlement. The ones he'd refused to burn. The ones playing in the street who didn't deserve to die for someone else's war. "All right," Jake whispered to the wind, his voice barely carrying over the howl. "All right." He stepped into the nest and sat down among the monsters. Jake learned fast that survival on this frozen rock meant throwing away everything he thought he knew. The military had taught him discipline and strategy, but nothing prepared him for raising dragon babies. The hatchlings didn't understand what he was at first. The biggest one, with scales the color of rust, kept snapping at Jake's hands whenever he got close. Those baby teeth were still sharp enough to punch through his gloves and draw blood. The middle one, darker with smoke-gray scales, watched his every move with suspicious eyes. The smallest, covered in ash-colored scales so pale they were almost white, was too weak to do much of anything. Jake started calling them Rusty, Smoke, and Pale. Not creative, but he was too tired to care. Hunger made them desperate enough to tolerate him. Jake's rations were long gone, which meant he had to hunt or starve. The massive elk that roamed the lower valleys became his targets. They were huge things twice the size of any animal back on Earth, with thick fur and antlers that could gore a man in seconds. Each hunt took hours. Jake would track through snow drifts that reached his chest, his legs burning with exhaustion. His knife was pathetic for the job, but it was all he had. He'd wait for the perfect moment, strike at the throat, and pray the beast went down before it killed him. The first time he managed to bring down an elk, dragging it back up the mountain almost finished him. The carcass must have weighed 300 pounds. Jake's shoulders screamed. His back felt like it was breaking. He had to stop every few minutes, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, wondering if he'd just die right there in the snow. But he made it. And when the hatchlings tore into the meat, their eyes glowing brighter with satisfaction, something in Jake's chest loosened. They ate. He'd kept them alive another day. It became routine. Brutal, exhausting routine. Hunt, drag, feed, repeat. Slowly the hatchlings began to trust him. Rusty started following Jake down the mountain on his hunts, clumsy and loud but trying his best to help. Smoke watched everything Jake did with those intelligent eyes, learning his movements, his patterns. Pale, the weakest of the three, needed the most care. Jake would cut the meat into smaller pieces for him, make sure he got enough to eat before his siblings devoured everything. The dragons who flew overhead noticed. Jake saw them circling, massive creatures whose wingspans blocked out what little sun this planet had. Their scales gleamed like armor, and their eyes tracked him with cold curiosity. They were waiting, Jake realized. Waiting for nature to fix this mistake. Waiting for him to die like every other human who'd been dumped on this rock. But Jake didn't die. He built a windbreak using rocks and his shredded thermal blanket. It wasn't much, but it blocked some of the constant wind. He figured out which caves offered the best shelter. He learned to read the sky, to know when a storm was coming. When the first real storm hit at the end of his first month, Jake thought it would be his last night alive. The temperature dropped so fast his breath froze solid. The wind howled like something alive and angry. The hatchling's mother would have covered them with her massive body, kept them warm with her heat. Jake had no such size. He was just a man, small and soft compared to these creatures. So he did the only thing he could. He wrapped Pale in his jacket, the last piece of warm clothing he had. He pulled Rusty and Smoke close to his sides and held them, his arms barely reaching around their growing bodies. His teeth chattered so hard he thought they'd crack. His body shook violently. He prayed his body heat would be enough to keep them alive, even if it killed him. The young dragons, confused by this strange creature's stubborn determination, did something unexpected. They curled their bodies around him in return. Their scales were warm, heated from within by the fire growing in their bellies. They formed a protective circle with Jake at the center. They kept each other alive that night. Above them, perched on the cliffs, the elder dragons watched. Something stirred in their ancient minds. Something they hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. Respect. By the second month, Jake had learned to understand the dragon's sounds. The low rumble that meant danger nearby. The sharp bark that was a hunting call. The soft chirp they made when they were content. He started making the sounds back, his human throat struggling with the harsh noises. The hatchlings had tripled in size. They were growing fast, getting stronger every day. And they started bringing Jake food. The first time Rusty dropped a dead snow rabbit at Jake's feet, nearly crushing his leg in the process, Jake actually laughed. It was clumsy. The rabbit was half-eaten. But the intent was clear. They were taking care of him too. When the ice wolves came, drawn by the scent of the nest and fresh meat, Jake stood at the entrance with his knife. The blade was chipped now, barely sharp, but he held it steady. The hatchlings moved beside him, their fire weak but fierce. Rusty roared, the sound more like a squeak. Smoke breathed a small stream of flame. Pale bared his teeth. The wolves, 6 of them with eyes that glowed in the dark, hesitated. They'd expected an easy meal. Instead they found a human and 3 dragons standing together. The wolves retreated into the night. The watching dragons descended lower from their perches. This human, this fragile creature that should have been dead a dozen times over, was doing the impossible. He was surviving. And more than that, he was thriving. He'd become one of them. The mountain shook when Scar arrived. That wasn't the dragon's real name. Jake couldn't wrap his human tongue around the harsh, grinding syllables of true draconic speech. But he'd heard the hatchling's terrified response to that particular roar echoing across the peaks, and he knew exactly what it meant. The killer had come back. Jake had been gathering firewood when he felt the first tremor beneath his feet. Small rocks tumbled down the cliff face. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a deep, bone-shaking frequency. Then came the roar, a sound so massive it made Jake's chest hurt. He dropped the wood and ran back toward the nest, his heart hammering. Rusty, Smoke, and Pale were already pressed against the back of the cave, their eyes wide with terror. They'd grown so much over the past 4 months. They were adolescent dragons now, nearly the size of small houses. Their scales had hardened, their fire had strengthened, and they'd learned to hunt on their own. But right now they looked like scared children again. "Stay behind me," Jake said, even though he knew how ridiculous that sounded. What could he do against a full-grown dragon? Scar landed at the nest's entrance, and Jake understood why the hatchlings were terrified. This wasn't just any dragon. This was a nightmare given form. The beast was absolutely massive, easily 3 times the size of the hatchlings. His scales were black as the void of space, edged with deep crimson that looked like dried blood. Scars crisscrossed his body, proof of countless battles won. His eyes glowed with an intelligence that was somehow worse than mindless rage. This dragon knew exactly what he was doing. The impact of his landing cracked the ice beneath them. Jake felt the ground split under his boots. He steadied himself, gripping his knife so hard his knuckles turned white. The blade looked like a toothpick compared to the monster in front of him. Rusty, Smoke, and Pale moved behind Jake, forming a line. They were shaking, but they didn't run. 4 months of survival together had built something stronger than fear. Scar's laugh rumbled like an avalanche starting its descent. The sound rolled through Jake's chest, shaking his ribs. The dragon's enormous head swung toward Jake, nostrils flaring as he took in the human's scent. Those ancient eyes studied him with cold amusement. Then Scar spoke. The words were grinding and ancient, syllables that sounded like rocks being crushed together. Jake had been trying to learn the language for months now, listening to the hatchlings and the elder dragons overhead. He'd practiced until his throat bled, forcing his human vocal cords to make sounds they weren't designed for. He understood what Scar said: "Prey stands before me." Every instinct screamed at Jake to run, to dive off the cliff and hope for a quick death. This dragon had killed the hatchling's mother, had torn her apart with those massive claws and left her children to freeze. Now he'd come back to finish the job, and Jake was just an inconvenience. But Jake thought about those children back on that settlement. The ones he'd refused to burn. He'd lost everything for them. Lost his career, his freedom, his life. He'd been dumped on this frozen planet to die alone. Except he hadn't died alone. He'd found a family in the most unlikely place. Jake's response came out broken and painful. Each word felt like swallowing glass. His human throat wasn't made for this language, but he forced the syllables out anyway. "You faced for not one." The effect was immediate. The watching dragons, dozens of them perched on every peak around the nest, went completely silent. The wind itself seemed to stop. Time held its breath. No prey had ever spoken their tongue. No lesser being had ever claimed to stand with dragons as equals. Jake had just done the impossible. He challenged Scar not as a victim, but as part of the hatchling's family. Scar's eyes narrowed to slits. The amusement vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. His wings spread wide, blocking out what little light filtered through the clouds. The membranes were torn in places, more proof of his countless battles. Steam rose from his nostrils. He spoke again, and this time there was no humor in his voice. Just deadly promise. Then, die together. The temperature around them dropped as Scar drew breath. Jake could see the glow building in the dragon's throat, blue-white fire hot enough to melt stone. Hot enough to vaporize a human in seconds. Rusty roared behind him, a sound that was deeper now, more mature. Smoke and Pale added their voices. The 3 hatchlings spread their wings, trying to look bigger than they were. Jake raised his knife, the blade catching the light from Scar's gathering fire. He knew this was suicide. He knew he couldn't win. But he'd made his choice 4 months ago when he'd decided to stay with 3 abandoned babies instead of saving himself. The attack came like a storm breaking. Scar lunged forward, claws extended, jaws open wide enough to swallow Jake whole. His fire erupted, turning the air itself into a weapon. Jake didn't run. He stood his ground. The battle had begun. Jake knew he couldn't win. Scar's smallest claw was longer than Jake's entire body. The dragon's fire burned hot enough to turn rock into liquid. One direct hit and Jake would be nothing but ash scattered across the ice. But honestly, he'd been dead the moment they dropped him on this planet. Everything since then had been borrowed time. 4 months of life he shouldn't have had. 4 months of watching Rusty, Smoke, and Pale grow. 4 months of feeling like he belonged somewhere. If this was how it ended, at least it meant something. Rusty struck first. The young dragon launched himself from above, diving at Scar with his claws extended. He was brave, Jake would give him that. But Scar barely moved. One massive wing came up and swatted Rusty aside like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. Rusty crashed into the cliff wall, scales cracking, and tumbled to the ground. Smoke tried to flank from the side, using the tactics Jake had taught her during their hunts. She was smart, always had been. But Scar's tail whipped around faster than anything that size should move. It shattered the ice beneath her and sent her tumbling backward, her legs scrambling for purchase on the slippery ground. Pale, the smallest and weakest, breathed a stream of fire directly at Scar's face. It was the bravest thing Jake had ever seen the timid dragon do. But Scar walked through the flames like they were nothing. He didn't even blink. The fire washed over his black scales and disappeared. Jake ran forward while Scar was distracted. His knife felt pathetic in his hand, like bringing a toothpick to a sword fight. But he'd studied dragons for 4 months now. He knew their bodies. There was a joint in the foreleg where the scales didn't quite meet, a gap in the armor. It was the only weak point he could reach. Scar's massive claw came down like a falling building. This should have been the end. Jake Cole, exiled soldier and fool, crushed into the ice and forgotten. Another human who died on Draken Prime. Another name nobody would remember. But Rusty saw it coming. The young dragon, battered and bleeding from hitting the wall, threw himself into the path. The blow that was meant to crush Jake caught Rusty instead. Scar's claws tore through scales that had just started to harden. Blood, darker than human blood and smoking in the cold air, sprayed across the ice. Rusty screamed in pain. Jake's vision went white. Not from snow or cold, but from pure rage. This dragon, this child he'd raised from a terrified baby, had just taken a killing blow meant for him. What happened next was a blur. Jake didn't remember climbing up Scar's massive leg, using the scales like ladder rungs. Didn't remember driving his knife into the gap between the dragon's neck scales, the blade sinking deep into flesh that was hot enough to burn his hands. Didn't remember Scar's roar of pain, so loud it made Jake's ears ring. Didn't remember the massive head swinging around trying to shake him off. He remembered Smoke's scream though. That cut through everything else. Jake looked down and saw Scar's jaws opening wide, aimed at Pale. The smallest dragon was frozen in fear, too scared to move. Those massive teeth, each one the size of Jake's arm, were going to close around Pale and end him. Jake didn't think. He just jumped. He threw himself between Scar's killing bite and Pale, arms spread wide like he could somehow shield a dragon 3 times his size. It was stupid. It was suicide. It was the only thing he could do. The pain hit like nothing Jake had ever felt. Scar's teeth sheared through his ribs like they were made of paper. He felt bones shatter, felt skin and muscle tear away. The heat of dragon fire seared everything, cooking what was left. His vision went red, then black, then red again. Jake fell into the snow. His blood steamed in the frozen air, melting the ice beneath him. He couldn't feel his legs. Couldn't feel much of anything except a spreading cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Above him, Rusty, Smoke, and Pale screamed. The sound was heartbreaking, full of grief and rage and desperation. Their human was dying. The creature who'd chosen them over his own survival was bleeding out in the snow. Something in their young hearts broke open. Their flames synchronized for the first time. All 3 breathed fire together, the streams merging into one. Their attacks found rhythm, moving as one unit instead of 3 separate dragons. They fought with a coordination that young dragons never achieved, the kind of teamwork that came from months of survival together. From trust. From love for the human who'd stayed when he should have run. The elder dragons watching from every peak saw something they'd forgotten in 10,000 years. They saw what real strength looked like. Not power. Not size. But sacrifice. loyalty. Well, one by one they entered the battle. Not for territory. Not for pride. Not because of some ancient dragon law. They fought for a human who'd shown them what warmth truly meant. Scar faced the fury of an entire mountain. He fought back, roaring defiance, his blue-white fire scorching the sky. He'd killed dozens in single combat. He was a legend among dragons. But even legends fall. When the great black dragon finally crashed into the ice, defeated and dying, the mountain went silent. The wind stopped howling. Even the snow seemed to pause in the air. Jake lay in the snow, 3 dragon hatchlings pressed against his broken body, keening their grief to the uncaring sky. Their warmth couldn't save him now. Nothing could. He smiled anyway, tasting blood. His vision was fading, the edges going dark. But he could see them. His kids. Say, good kids, Jake whispered. And then the exile who'd saved monsters closed his eyes for the last time. Dragons do not bury their dead. That's not how their culture works. When a dragon dies, they return the body to the elements. Sky and fire and wind. Ashes scattered across the peaks they once ruled. No graves. No markers. Just memory. But Jake Cole was different. The elder dragons carried his broken body to the Peak of Ancients, the highest point on Draken Prime. It was a sacred place where only the greatest dragon elders were laid to rest. The wind there howled constantly, strong enough to rip wings. The ice never melted. It was a place of honor reserved for legends. Every dragon on the planet came. Hundreds of them, filling the sky with wings. It was a gathering not seen in millennia. Young dragons who'd only heard stories. Ancient dragons who remembered when the world was different. They all came to honor the human who'd done the impossible. They performed the rite of fire. It was cremation, but not like humans did it. Dragon fire, pure and ancient, channeled together until the flames burned white-hot. They returned Jake to the elements with the same ceremony they used for their greatest heroes. But then they did something unprecedented. Something that had never been done in 10,000 years of dragon history. The eldest dragons, the ones whose scales had turned silver with age, channeled their flames together. They focused the heat to a single point, maintaining it for hours. The temperature was so intense it turned the air itself to plasma. And slowly Jake's ashes began to crystallize. They formed into a scale. Translucent and beautiful, catching the light like a prism. It glowed with a warmth that didn't fade, as if Jake's spirit had been trapped inside. A piece of him preserved forever. Rusty, Smoke, and Pale each took a shard. They were full-grown now, their scales hardened into armor, their wings strong enough to cross continents. But they handled the fragments with the gentleness they'd learned from Jake. They embedded the pieces into their chest armor, directly over their hearts. The scales fused with their own, becoming part of them. Jake would fly with them now. Forever. Rusty's voice had deepened, powerful enough to shake mountains. He spoke in the ancient tongue, the words carrying across every peak. He will fly with us. Always. Every dragon present bowed their heads. A gesture of respect they gave only to their own elders. But Jake had earned it. 3 months passed. Life on Draken Prime continued. But the story spread. When the Galactic Coalition finally sent a recovery ship to collect the exiles' remains, they expected to find bones scattered in the ice. Standard procedure. Document the death, file the paperwork, forget the name. Captain Linda Hayes sat in the command chair, reviewing the mission brief. Jake Cole exiled for refusing orders. Expected survival time, 1 week. Actual time, 4 months. Unusual, but it happens sometimes. Lucky bastard probably found a cave. Then the sensor started screaming. Her science officer, Dan Foster, went pale as he stared at his screens. Ma'am, I'm reading hundreds of heat signatures. Massive ones. Linda leaned forward. Define massive. Dragon-sized, ma'am. Every dragon on the planet appears to be. He paused, checking his readings again. They're gathered in one location. In formation. The view screen shifted, showing the Peak of Ancients. Dragons filled the sky and covered every surface. And in the center stood a monument of melted stone and shaped ice, carved with symbols Linda didn't recognize. What is that? She whispered. The communication system crackled. A voice came through, speaking human words with a grinding accent that made the translator work overtime. It was Rusty, who'd learned enough of Jake's language to make himself understood. Jake Cole is ours. He died. With honor. Greater than yours. Linda felt ice in her veins. Repeat that. He protected our young. Cast him away. We claim him. Now. Linda looked at the tactical display. Hundreds of dragons, all watching her ship. All waiting. One word from her and they'd rip the vessel apart. Set course for home, she ordered quietly. Maximum speed. The ship retreated. But Linda filed a report. And that report changed everything. The story spread like wildfire across the galaxy. News networks picked it up. Social media exploded. A human, the weakest species in known space, had done something impossible. He'd earned the respect of dragons. Not through weapons or technology or force. Through compassion. Through sacrifice. Through warmth. Rusty, Smoke, and Pale grew into legends themselves. They wore Jake's scale proudly, and whenever another being asked about it, they told his story. Every detail. Every moment. Dragons listened. Other species listened. The tale spread to every corner of known space. Jake Cole's name became required teaching at every military academy. His story became a case study in leadership, in moral courage, in what it meant to be human. The soldier who'd been court-martialed became the most celebrated figure in Coalition history. General Harrison, the one who'd sentenced Jake, resigned in disgrace. The military rewrote their policies on civilian casualties. Commanders who'd followed orders without question started asking harder questions. Jake changed how humanity saw itself. Not as conquerors or warriors but as protectors. As beings capable of impossible compassion. On Draken Prime the monument still stands. Dragons guarded in shifts ensuring no one ever forgets. Pilgrims from every species come to see it, to honor the exile who became a legend. The exile who lost everything gained immortality. The soldier who saved monsters became the bridge between worlds. In the ice and stone, Jake's final words were carved in both human script and Draconic. They were just kids. And beneath it, added by the dragons in their ancient language, so was he.